Okay.
We are live.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Great. Thanks so much. Okay.
That one, you need that.
This one?
Yeah, both of them.
Oh.
Okay, everyone, good afternoon. Okay, everyone, good afternoon. Today we have a talk by Azita Chellappoo. Is that okay? He is going to speak about disciplining bodies, race, racialization, and the global obesity epidemic. Thank you very much, Azita, for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So this is the outline of what I'm going to say. I might not get through all of it, but I'm just going to start by introducing some stuff that you'll probably already be familiar with, this framing of obesity as an epidemic, the biomedical model of obesity, and maybe some stuff that might be more new to you, this sort of pushback to that and this debate over obesity or fatness. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about historical work, about the racial origins of anti-fatness, and then how race and fatness kind of intersect in contemporary biomedicine and in public health. And then if I have time, I'll talk a bit about some work I published last year about race and fatness in the context of COVID-19. Okay, so I think probably we're all quite familiar with the kinds of research, narratives, discourses that frame obesity as a problem. Just some examples of magazine covers, scientific papers, statements by organizations like the WHO about the so-called obesity epidemic. Sometimes it gets called a pandemic that's sweeping the world. In the context of COVID-19, there's been this talk of twin pandemics or this syndemic of COVID and obesity. So it's kind of framed as an even more urgent problem. And of course, it's not just restricted to the realms of public health or of biomedicine, but also this thing which people have called diet culture. So this idea that we should all be pursuing weight loss, that there is such a thing as an ideal weight, and these kinds of, so you've got this sort of interaction, this nexus between these public health statements and the scientific research and our own individual behaviors and how we think about our own bodies. So just to kind of lay out this biomedical model, so obesity is a central target of concern for scientists, public health experts, policymakers, clinicians, and individuals. Here are some sort of typical components of this mainstream or dominant understanding of obesity. Thank you. So obesity as an epidemic, so that usually means, refers to this idea that the number of individuals globally classified as obese is rising, that obesity is inherently dysfunctional, unhealthy, or diseased. Some people think obesity is a disease in itself. That's kind of a debate still ongoing in medicine, philosophy of medicine. But as such, it constitutes this public health crisis that requires the attention of policymakers, scientists, public health researchers, and the public at large. So those are kind of the core tenets, and sometimes, pretty often, that also comes along with this idea that obesity is within an individual's control, that's therefore a question of individual responsibility, and sometimes we have this kind of stigma and shaming comes along with someone's body size. There is, I think, growing recognition of what is termed weight stigma amongst people, for example, in public health or in medicine. But typically, these researchers, even weight stigma researchers, won't challenge these core components. So obesity is still constructed as inherently dysfunctional and something that needs to be tackled or eradicated, sometimes it's seen as something that should nevertheless not be shamed, maybe be pitied. But the sort of other side of this is the kind of disruption and critique and opposition that's been offered in recent decades by both scholars and activists, so within disciplines like fat studies, but also within fat liberation or fat justice movements. These are just some books that challenge this mainstream understanding of fatness. So challenging the notion that obesity is an epidemic, that it's increasing at an alarming rate, and that justifies the framing of it as a public health crisis. Some of these researchers talk about that framing as a moral panic, challenging the idea that fatness is inherently unhealthy. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but also bringing questions of fat stigma and anti-fat discrimination on an interpersonal and structural level, like to the forefront, and challenging damaging cultural representations of fatness. You have this really contested landscape. And this is really just a kind of justification of my interest in it, that you've got obesity, which is this topic of intense scientific and public interest, and the science of obesity specifically is a really important part of our sort of broader understandings about body size, weight loss, and health, and you've got this really contested terrain. So I think all of this makes this really interesting for philosophers of science, but there's really been very little attention paid to it, despite, I think, lots of interesting philosophical questions. And I'm going to talk about now just this one aspect, this connection with race, but I think there's lots and lots of other questions there, and that's something I'm hoping to do more work on going forward. So just a quick note on terminology. So the term obesity itself has been challenged by fat studies scholars and activists. So Marilyn Wan says that it has normative and pathologizing connotations. She sees it as a medical term which designates fatness as a pathology in itself. So you're coming in with that assumption. There's similar criticisms that have been leveled against terms like underweight, normal weight, and overweight. I think the normative connotations there are pretty obvious. And so in contrast, Marilyn Wan says, there's nothing negative or rude in the word fat unless someone makes the effort to put it there. Using the word fat as a descriptor, not a discriminator, can help dispel prejudice. And the term fat has become the accepted term in these spaces for people with larger bodies. And I just, that might be maybe new to some of you, but I just wanted to say that, so I'll be using obesity when I'm referring to like the scientific work that relies on that term, but otherwise I'll be using the term fat or fatness. Okay, so just to, maybe some of you will already be kind of familiar with this, with fat politics, but just in case, I just wanted to flesh out a little bit why there's been this pushback, why there's this contestation, this rethinking of fatness as maybe a social category more than a biological. So fat phobia or anti-fat discrimination is a pervasive feature of society, and this means that fat people have systematically different life experiences to thin people. So perhaps we should be seeing fatness not as a given biological category, but as a social category that represents a positioning of certain kinds of bodies within a social hierarchy. So I'm not going to give kind of systematic argument for that third claim, but I am just going to flesh out a little bit this issue of fat phobia and how there's this kind of deep social element. So there's plenty of quantitative evidence when it comes to the impact, the prevalence and the impact of fat phobia. Here's just a few statistics. So fat children are more likely to experience social isolation and bullying. And weight stigma is associated with mental health harms. There's also a lot of evidence for medical fat phobia, so doctors spend less time in appointments with fat patients compared to thinner patients, and patients who report having experienced weight bias in the clinic have poorer treatment outcomes and are more likely to avoid future care. There's also evidence for economic inequalities. Fat people receive lower starting salaries, can be ranked as less qualified, and can work longer hours. They can be perceived to be less suitable for employment and less likely to be invited for an interview. And there are studies that show a correlation between fatness and lower socioeconomic status. And here is, there's also plenty of qualitative evidence and sort of personal experiences. Here's just some quotes that I took from a study carried out in Australia. So these are quotes from people who were interviewed. Someone says, "I had a miscarriage and I told someone and they said to me just in the middle of the street, 'Oh, well, it was probably all for the best.' And I said, 'Why?' And they said, 'Well, you wouldn't want to have a child when you're that weight.' I was just devastated." Another person says, "The manager at my job told me that I had to lose weight because it was affecting my work. I work on the web making websites available to people with disabilities. My weight is completely irrelevant. I was so stunned that she thought she could call me on that." And then this very sad quote, "My family keep talking about me being fat and it's just totally depressing. I go home, I feel sad, I feel lonely." And so I think I will skip this for time reasons, but there are some philosophers who are thinking about fatness and inequality, and Ella argues for the existence of fat oppression. So the idea is that fat people suffer this kind of unjust systematic harm that looks similar to other kinds of oppression. And before I go on, I also just wanted to, without kind of going into too much detail, just wanted to give a sense that actually the connection between fatness and poorer health outcomes, so that's something that's a core component of the biomedical understanding of fatness or obesity, and I think all of us are kind of familiar with that idea, but it's actually a little bit more complicated and messy than we might think. So Catherine Flegel, there's this big study that was carried out when she was at the CDC that compared the risk of mortality across BMI groups, so BMI, body mass index. And they found that in the US, the lowest mortality risk was in the overweight category. In comparison, Americans in the normal weight category had approximately 86,000 excess deaths per year. And people in the moderately obese and very obese categories had 112,000 excess deaths, but people in the underweight category had also approximately 34,000 excess deaths. So the analysis indicated that more Americans who are not overweight or obese die prematurely every year than Americans who are. And the risk of premature death associated with obesity was negligible or non-existent until BMI 35. I don't know if you're familiar with the BMI categories, but that is fairly high. And in contrast, the risk associated with being underweight was very high. Paul Campos says that the authors found the risk of premature death was higher among women who look like Kate Moss or Gwyneth Paltrow than the combined premature death risk found among average height women at all weight levels above 203 pounds. And he makes this kind of obvious point that if a certain weight level is associated with the lowest risk of premature death, what does it mean to label such people overweight? One thing that I think is really interesting about obesity science, the sort of scientific community that is investigating obesity, is the way in which these kinds of findings are received. So Catherine Flegel just last year published a kind of personal essay about her experience after publishing this study, and the way in which it was received. So she says, I'd expected some modest interest in our findings pursued through normal channels of scientific discussion. I'd not expected an aggressive campaign that included insults, errors, misinformation, behind-the-scenes gossip and maneuvers, social media posts, and even complaints to my employer. So it's not something I'm going to talk about that much today, but I think that there are really interesting questions about the ways in which the biomedical model is upheld and the ways in which dissenting views are quashed. Okay, so the racial origins of fat phobia. So there's this recent book by Sabrina Strings that argues that there are these two critical historical developments that contributed to this fetish for sveltness and a phobia about fatness. The rise of the transatlantic slave trade, race science, and related rhetoric linked fatness to greedy Africans, and secondly, the spread of Protestantism in America, where religious rhetoric tied eating patterns and body size to religious morality and suggested overeating was ungodly. So in Strings' story, so she starts with the Renaissance, and she argues that larger, fleshier physiques used to be prized, but there was this growing population of black women who came to Europe as part of the slave trade during the High Renaissance in the late 15th, 16th century. She describes how African women were described as well-proportioned and plump and sort of viewed as physically appealing, and yet there was this growing discourse that suggested that their purportedly distinctive facial features made them facially unattractive. So it was kind of the facial features rather than the body size that formed the early basis of these social distinctions between low-status African women and their high-status European counterparts. But by the turn of the 17th century, black women were shifting from the aesthetic counterparts to European women to their aesthetic counterpoints. So she suggests that their novelty kind of wore off in areas where the slave trade had been going on the longest, and then black women's figures also started to be described as inferior. She says that this objectification of black bodies and labor through the slave trade turned black people themselves into shadow figures of modernity, appearing to exist outside of and in opposition to it. And so black people came to increasingly represent difference, or this perverse primitivity and backwardness, and they were progressively progressively represented as what she calls small, low, and foul. And she says at the same time in England there was this new trend taking off amongst English intellectuals, kind of in a parallel way, where fatness was being linked to irrationality, and thinness was kind of this bodily proof of rationality or intelligence. So she says, whereas women's physicality had been largely outside the social distinctions made between Europeans and Africans in the Renaissance, by the 18th century it was treated as foundational to them. And then she talks about this growth of race science, the Comte de Buffon, who had been aware of the stereotype of Africans as being black, meager, and very small. So that was a previous stereotype. And he noted there was kind of diversity amongst the people of Africa, and he described the plumpness of black Africans as evidence of their idleness. And then we obviously have the famous case of Sarah Bartman, who was displayed as this Hottentot woman, who was famously put on display and kind of became the symbol of black femininity. And Strings describes how this helped make fatness an intrinsically black and then therefore implicitly off-putting form of feminine embodiment in the European imagination. And I won't maybe spend too long of this, but then Strings also goes through America in the 19th century, the role of theories of Anglo-Saxon superiority, in response to immigration from Ireland and so on. So it was not just anti-blackness, but Irish women were also commonly derided as being greedy and fat, and Anglo-Saxon women were the flag bearers of this new standard of beauty, was rooted in morality, health, and racial pride. She mentions Elizabeth Bisland, who wrote of thinness as a form of American exceptionalism, so this type of beauty that was only possible in America, where the best of all races, those from Northern and Western Europe, had arrived. These desirable immigrants had mixed and mingled to produce progeny who were tall and beautiful and, importantly, thin. So Sandra Gilman also talks about this connection between race and fatness. So he says it's only in modernity, with the secular transformation of obesity from a mark of sin to a mark of illness, that the Jew's body comes to represent all of the potential for disease and decay associated with an obese body. So he notes this labeling of Jews as a diabetic race in the 19th century, and says that the obesity inherent in the Jew's body and soul was seen as the cause of the illness. And there was this sort of idea that diabetes was like this Jewish disease. There became this connection between diabetes, obesity, and Jewishness. And there was also aspects of anti-fatness in the context of India. Maybe I won't spend too much time on this, but Forth notes that the corpulence of upper caste Hindus remained the subject of discussion amongst travelers, ethnographers, and physicians. There was this assumption that there was this love of fat, particularly because it was high caste Indians, and some it was sort of seen as this kind of perverse cultural perversity that fatness was put on a pedestal rather than being derided. So String's thesis is that the rise of the transatlantic slave trade linked fatness with blackness, and therefore fatness was cast as other. And we see similar linkages with other racial others. And Forth talks about this cultural alignment of fatness and savagery, which is present in the colonial encounters with Indians as well as Indigenous Australians. And there's been some recent work talking about the kind of ongoing contemporary connection between anti-blackness and anti-fatness. So Hunter Ashley Shackelford asks, what if instead of believing that blackness and fatness are separate embodiments, that we connect the shrinking and active killing of blackness as the same violence that asks us to shrink and disappear all fat bodies? And they write that the spectrum of punishment and violence for fat people is always in direct relationship with anti-blackness. We have something similar from Deshawn Harrison, who says that it is through the unremarkability and unpleasantness of how fatness dressed black flesh that created the structures that necessitate the marginalization of both identities. And they say from the moment white Europeans saw fat Africans, the science that followed that was intended to always separate them from the rest. So these authors see anti-fatness and anti-blackness as being really intimately linked in ways that play out in the scientific public health and public discourse. And both Shackelford and Harrison draw on this case of Eric Garner. This man that was murdered by police officers. So here, in the case of Eric Garner's murder, it's interesting to note what the police had to say to one another. On this police forum, several verified law enforcement officers publicly sided with the decision not to indict the accused officer. Instead, the remarks reflected the police officers' impatience with and distaste for what they perceived as a thug who they were not allowed by law to brutalize. Some blamed Garner's death on his weighing 400 pounds. Others called him a walking heart attack, suggesting his family sue Domino's or McDonald's. And Peter King remarked, if Garner had not had asthma and a heart condition and was not so obese, almost definitely he would not have died. And this was definitely part of the sort of like broader conversation around Eric Garner. This is like an illustration of the kind of horrific ways in which anti-blackness and anti-fatness can intersect. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about how those kind of connections happen or play out in biomedicine and also briefly in public health. So James Neal in 1962 proposed this idea of the thrifty genotype. So this genotype that was designed for survival in hunter-gatherer conditions, this kind of feast or famine idea that no longer worked so well when people came to enjoy the so-called blessings of civilization, so the possibility of becoming obese and sedentary. So the idea is that the carriers of the thrifty genes would have survived in our past because they're able to deposit fat during feasts, which that they can then use during famines. But this kind of makes us maladapted for our current environment. And here are just some quotes that show the ways in which this kind of narrative has been racialized. So Marjorie Fee notes that this is from the Indian Northern Affairs Canada report. A high waist-to-hip ratio may be related to the thrifty gene concept, which suggests that people coming from a harsh environment where food supplies are often scarce develop an ability to store fat more efficiently. This promotes weight gain and predisposes an individual to insulin resistance. And then the Pima Indians of Arizona owe their survival to their thrifty gene. Their bodies are remarkably efficient at storing fat, which is a useful trait if you live in the desert. Today, though, the Pima live a short drive away from McDonald's, Wendy's, and Taco Bell, and they have one of the highest rates of obesity and diabetes in the world. So certain populations are being singled out as being particularly predisposed to obesity because of supposedly evolved genetic differences. And I thought I would say a little bit about work that Abul Saldana Tejeda and Peter Wade have done in Mexico. So this is a paper where they conducted interviews with geneticists and doctors to explore this connection between racial discourse and the fears of obesity in Mexico. So they say that in Mexico, ideas about racialized genetic and cultural ancestry impinge not only on indigenous minorities, but also on the majority mestizo population, bringing racialized pathologization into play for a nominally normalized unmarked category. They say that geneticists use this questionable evolutionary hypothesis when explaining high rates of obesity and diabetes. The thrifty gene hypothesis attributes a significant causal role to indigenous American genetic ancestry. One striking feature of this Mexican data is how clearly this genetic discourse racializes and pathologizes a subordinate minority in genetic terms, despite the term race not being used. When asked about the predisposition to obesity of Mexican mestizos and Mayan indigenous people, one of the geneticists interviewed replied, "I believe that today it's more and more clear that evidently predisposition to diseases is found in the indigenous part." Okay, so that's the kind of genetic explanations. And then we're also seeing this role of epigenetics becoming more and more popular. So this idea, I think, originally from the 1980s, Barker's hypothesis, this idea of the Thrifty Phenotype. So this environmental programming of metabolic pathways early in life. You might have heard of the developmental origins of health and disease framework, which is getting more popular in biomedicine. The idea is if, for example, you're a pregnant woman lives through, say, a famine, her body is sending signals that, we need to, sending signals to the fetus, programming these metabolic pathways, so they're going to be holding on to and storing and storing fat more readily, because that's the world that they're kind of expecting to be born into. But sometimes there can be this mismatch, and that supposedly contributes to predisposition to things like obesity. And obviously epigenetics is a big part of the story. And to return to Abril and Peter's work, so they have done more interviews thinking about the connections between the sort of continuities between eugenic discourses and more recent epigenetics research. So they say during the earliest 20th century in Mexico, when eugenics was a major frame for medical science and public health policy, obesity was defined as a negative influence on the nation's